So with that, let's get started. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Jerrod Chong, VP of Solutions at Yubico. Jerrod.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So I'll start off with mentioning about, talk about FIDO. I know we're not doing a lot of intro here, but some of you may be familiar with another terminology as it pertains to the FIDO technology with security keys. Security keys has been in the marketplace for over 3 years actually, and that's based on the FIDO U2F standard. And the FIDO UF2F standard obviously belongs as part of the FIDO organization. And though we have probably heard of various implementers beyond these services for implementing the security keys, here are some notable ones that you may or may not be familiar with. The goal obviously is to be able to use a single authenticator with any number of services and keeping the sense of a high level of security as well as privacy preserving. And the goal obviously from the ecosystem perspective is really focused on a really simple experience, maintaining high level of security, have a high level of also scalability for us from a user perspective as well as from an implementer's perspective, at the same time maintaining privacy. So this just shows, for those who are not familiar or may not be aware, this is the one slide to show the experience of the security key / FIDO U2F user login flow, which Google was the first service to enable such a capability. And there are others as I've described. So one of the big things that we've seen over the years is the ability to tie strong authentication with various ecosystems, given that there are a variety of authentication solutions, technologies, and protocols, particularly with how we talk about getting a digital identity in terms of various government agencies or services. One of the first servers that used the U2F protocol was gov.uk verify. Today, you can actually use a FIDO U2F authenticator to log in to these services. But what we wanted to do as we explore further areas on how FIDO U2F can enable more ecosystems as it pertains to not just federal or government services is to see the core issue between what we start with issuing an identity. So one of the big areas that we want to focus on is to look at how we tie strong authentication to a user identity, as most of the time we look at strong authentication as maybe separate, or maybe you have a different process to onboard the user. And what does it mean for a world where actually they are tied together? Today we see a lot of FIDO authentication solutions decoupled from the ID proofing perspective. There are obviously advantages for that particular use cases, but there are also many use cases that you want to tie that to a strong ID proof verification to that user, particularly for both not necessarily just high assurance levels, but also if there are certain businesses that wanted the ability to do that in a way that they are mandated by regulatory compliance. We've seen a number of challenges with ID proofing and strong authentication in regards to privacy, and we wanted to explore what are those areas that we can actually help mitigate. And today we've seen a lot of ID proofing technology based on knowledge-based verification. Knowledge-based verification, as a number of you will understand, is similar to like a password, where if I knew or guessed what that is, then I could be you, and that would break down the chain of being able to become you or impersonate you. And one of the big things that we start to see in the alliance as well is the huge dependency on recovery as you have strong authentication. So we talk a lot about let's lock down authentication to the service, and we need to also think about how do we get back to the service when you forget or you don't have the first factor or the second factor to get back to your accounts, and what are those recovery options. And in most cases, they are weak recovery options. And so if you actually have good ID proofing as part of the process, you actually could ID proof the individual or the user again, so that you don't have this weak chain in trying to protect the identities. One of the things that NIST does is to define what it is to be able to work closely with the ecosystem to solve this problem. So I'll read this off. Individuals and organizations utilize secure, efficient, easy to use, and interoperate identity solutions to access online services in a manner that promotes confidence, privacy, choice, and innovation. So this is what NIST has set out to do in terms of the TIG group, formerly known as the NSTIC group. Now, the goal is obviously building a framework so that the ecosystem can use existing commercial products, existing standards, open standards, to achieve this mission. And we've seen it clearly that this is a very aligned with what FIDO wants to do as well. Obviously, we don't have all the pieces, but we have a huge piece, which is really to help enable the secure, privacy preserving, as well as integrity of the authentication for identity solutions. I'll call a latest NIST publication as well to tie a couple of these concepts together. NIST has released 863-3, the revision 3, that's the -3. And I'll talk about this digital identity guideline. I think it's important as you look at the larger context of identity. Obviously, authentication falls into the identity framework. The goal is 3 areas that I think it's relevant to the discussion that we have today on ID proofing as well as strong authentication. The first guideline talks about how identity assurance and authenticator assurance can be separated. And the reason for this is in the previous guidelines, they were lumped into one. And that also meant that strong authentication would mostly be used for, I would say, high-level identity assurance. In this case, you could decouple it, which means that you could provide remote identity proofing with very strong authentication. So this guidance actually fits well into the new model where remote ID proofing is an acceptable model to issue out strong authenticators. The second is obvious from many different articles and breaches and latest incidents in the ecosystem where SMS has just been outrightly not a good form to use for strong authentication. And finally, which is the most relevant point as it pertains to the FIDO technologies, is that FIDO U2F has been approved as being able to meet the highest level of authentication assurance, AAL level 3, which is a huge milestone for the industry, for the work that we've done at FIDO to really enable FIDO authenticators to meet this high level of assurance level. So something about the project. So Yubico was awarded the NIST project, but the goal was to really focus on how can we build a framework and ecosystem to solve this identity proofing, strong authentication, and federation. They're all connected. If the audience is aware, IAM is a facet of all these 3 different areas to really provide the most efficient way in what we deemed as a digital identity for both your users as well as potentially your customers as well. Our goal is to make sure that there's a model where you could use a FIDO authenticator that you pre-issue. We'll talk about that after you've ID proofed the user. And then subsequently, after you've issued the authenticator, then services could be able to share the attributes very securely and conveniently in the model for federation. So what is an ID verified FIDO authenticator? So the concept is quite simple. After you ID proof the user, what you actually do is you pre-registered authenticated to that particular IDP or the service. And after you've done that, after you've done the pre-registration, then you can send the authenticator to the user. And the way we send the authenticator to the user is obviously there are various means. In our project, we've used standard U.S. postal mail, but you could create a system where it's done by a carrier, authorized carrier, that requires additional signatures and so on and so forth. You could do registered mail and so on and so forth. So getting the authenticator to the user is pre-registered, authenticated to the user as part of the process. And then subsequently, once the user has the authenticator, they can use the authenticator to log into the respective service that required the ID proofed registration. So I dive in a little bit deeper onto how this flow is to give an overall view on how it works. The core of the project was to build a ID proofing verification engine and then tie it to how we can issue out a FIDO authenticator. So let's start from kind of the flow beginning. I think this is really the meat of how we've designed this particular project. So say you have a service. In this case, on the right side, there's an RP1 and a relying party 1, relying party 2 on the right side that required to get some validation that this user was ID proof. And they are talking to some IDP store. So the process is this, not if there are many different services. In this case, we were different schools and educational institutions that could collectively work with some centralized government agency to get this information. They need to verify that the students or the teachers or the staff was ID proof before they actually allow them to access the services. So the first step for the user is to log in and prove the initial, this is I'm part of the system. And now they need to get to the next stage, which is to get to an authenticator that's been ID proof. So in the flow today, the next step is for them to download the mobile app. They would do this and tie that particular, what we deemed as a transient ID, because we're initiating the process, to a QR code. They will continue that journey on with scanning their whatever forms of identification. We started off with a driver's license. It could be additional forms of government issued ID like passports and so on and so forth. Then the IPV, which is the ID proofing verification engine, can do the user verification through whatever third-party proofing engine. Now, we've worked with several different ones. Obviously, the framework is to be able to allow to plug in different ones as technology improves, the scanning technology improves, the apps improve. You can plug in whatever third-party proofing engine that's required to work with various government identifications that whatever services approves of, whether it's driver's license or passport or some variant of that. After you've done that with the ID proofing engine, they would spit back working with the appropriate verification on who this person is with the name and address. And now this is important because we're going to use the name and address to ship the authenticators to the users. And in this case, the user would actually go ahead and what we deemed to be received the token, the authenticator, with what we call an activation code. I'll talk about a little bit about the token issuance in the slides, a few slides from now. But essentially, once they receive the physical device with an activation code, then they can log back in and deem to complete that flow of being ID proofed. And what happens after that is that the IDP data store at the top completes the binding of the user with the credentials that you got from the FIDO authenticator. And I'll talk about the FIDO key handle associated with the user. So in a sense, if you think about it, we are pre-registering the FIDO credential with the respective IDP for the user. Together, before we do that, is to ID proof the user. And then once it's done, the service can obviously get claims that it was the right user. We've ID proofed the user, and here are the things that you want to know about the user. This is the flow for the ID proofing mobile app. It's fairly straightforward. Install the app, get your driver's license out, scan the front, scan the back, and then there's obviously a flow if there's error conditions. The fallback today, from our perspective, if the mobile app has trouble or the the license is in a bad shape that it cannot be scanned, then we fall back to a in-house face-to-face ID proofing. Obviously, our goal is to make sure we can support as many remote proofing users or support users in a remote scenarios as possible. So token issuance is really the core of what we believe is how we're thinking about binding the ID of the user with the FIDO Authenticator. So we've seen in the previous slide that the ID proofing engine would return back the username, or I would say the user's name and the address. And this is really used so that we can actually ship the authenticator. Now the provisioning step here is that instead of having the user register in the case of FIDO authenticators in other services that we've described earlier, for example, in Google or in Facebook, the user is doing the registration to the Facebook service. Obviously that there's no ID proofing scenario there. So, obviously you can be an anonymous user. But in this case, we're pre-registering the user because we know we've verified the user, ID proofed the user. So now we pre-provision the authenticator to the service. And in this case, once we've done that, the user would log back into that same system to say that, I've done what you told me to do with scanning my ID and everything else, and I've received the authenticator, I received the authentication code that completes it, and therefore the binding can be complete in terms of the token issuance with the pre-register authenticator. And once we've done that, the important point here is that we don't want to keep user attributes more than necessary. So once we've finished actually the binding, we would discard all the other information that we do not need anymore to keep that in a way that we can comply with PII. So ultimately what we want is that the user has the authenticator that's been pre-registered to the store, the data store, and then the IDP can prove to other services who request for the user to authenticate that ID proof. If ID proof the user, they've got the authenticator, only this person could have logged into your service because we've ID proofed them and we've issued the token. I'll take one step deeper. Some of you are familiar with the protocols, and I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of the flow. So it's one of the things in the FIDO U2F protocol is the key handle. The key handle is really an ability for the authenticator to recreate the private key for signing later on. As you can see here, during the registration process, one of the things that happens in the FIDO authenticator is to generate a public key, private key, and the key handle. In the case of what we're doing in this project is to be able to move or pre-register this device so that we can take the public key and the key handle and move it to the appropriate data store for assigning it to the user. So in most cases, we're thinking of it as today you are doing the registration in most cases without ID proofing as anonymous and so on and so forth. And it just flows through as it directly binds to the user account directly after you registered the FIDO authenticator. In this case, we're putting a check first before we bind it to the user. We also want to ID proof the user before we just bind. And that particular area, because the protocol allows us to separate out the key handle and the public keys as a placeholder until the ID proof is done, this gives us the ability to integrate this flow into a larger context of an identity proofing protocol or solution or whatever federated options that we have for the variants of the framework. So how does the authentication flow after you've done the pre-registration, which is fairly common? We looked at it from a SP flow, which is a service provider flow. Now, the service provider in this situation doesn't have to ID proof the user. It's going to rely on whatever the IDP has done to ID proof the user. So the SP, in this case, the service provider is going to say, okay, I know this user is coming in. I see that he has an authenticator. You know whether he's been ID proof or not. So we redirect the user to the IDP that has already ID proofed the user. The user is logging into the IDP. The IDP knows, hey, I've seen this attribute before. I've seen this user before. I bound this user with this particular authenticator, FIDO authenticator. I have the key handle that I can verify. I have the other attributes that I know who these users are. And so we continue on the journey. The service provider will then be authorized to let this user in. The IDP will send the attributes. In this case, this is a pretty standard federated flow. We can solve this. We've made the project so that we work with both SAML-based federation as well as OpenID Connect based federated protocols. It's more or less the same flow. And when the IDP says, okay, I've already authenticated users, here all the, in the case of a SAML case, here the assertion in OpenID Connect flow, here are the access tokens for the user to use, and they carry on their merry way. And in this case, the service provider has two things. He has authenticated the user. He also had the high assurance that this user was ID proof by the IDP that he initiated this request with. So from a protocol perspective, again, you can see that the key handles used to help with the authentication. In this case, the key handle will help look up the private key, and then you associate it. The associated private key will be used to sign the challenge so that the user is authenticated. So this ties in the authentication flow. Obviously, this authentication flow is done in this case by the IDP, could be in other flows directly with the relying party. But in this case, when we talk about the ID proofing capabilities of what we're trying to do, the RP in this flow is the IDP that has already pre-registered the user, and he has a key handle to continue on with the authentication. So some items about the identity ecosystem and open standards. So our goal of the project was to look at what's available in the marketplace, what are the most common type of ID proofing technologies available, what are the federated protocols that either people have been using today or where they want to go, and a couple of areas as well where we wanted to focus on providing more toolkits to the open standards community and building the framework so that people know how to use FIDO as a protocol within these ecosystems. So what we've done is I don't think we released them yet, but we will release a number of different plugins for Shibboleth, which is a SAML-based federated protocol, OpenID Connect, which is another set of open standard federated protocol, and provide the ecosystem ability to kind of recreate the framework that we've described so that they can understand how to build in a federated flow and FIDO. But the secondly, which is more importantly as well, is to then, after you've talked about federation and FIDO, to add this additional layer of ID proofing, which I believe is how a lot of companies are thinking about it now, is how do you, we've got federation, we've got strong authentication, everything's, great. This ID proof topic has always been pushed aside and done separately. We took a step to say, how do we incorporate that into the overall flow? Given that if you're going to do strong authentication, which is great, and you're going to do federation, which is even better, consolidating all the services and strongly authenticated. But then the open question is, are you sure this user who's strongly authenticated to all the federated services is the right user? right? So most organizations have put this question to some other team to solve. We wanted to address it head on, which is like, if we're going to get to a model of strong authentication with many federated services, how do we make sure for those organizations that need to have strong ID proof that that is the right user rather than some anonymous user? So the foundation is to build that ID proofing engine and connect it with all the other pieces. So we built the framework, and we want to offer out the identity toolkit that solves this really end-to-end, what we deemed as an identity lifecycle. Most of us, I would say, are trying to focus on one or the other, but in several different contexts, you do want that whole identity lifecycle. ID proof the user, strongly authenticate, provide strong authentication, and then provide the federation to whatever services is needed. So this is a context of identity lifecycle that we want to provide. Now, as I mentioned earlier before, one of the key areas was to close the loop on weak recovery options as well. And this is a very relevant topic today, which is many people have maybe turned on strong authentication with FIDO and have done a lot of federation, and then the backup or the recovery flow falls outside this authentication flow or identity lifecycle flow, and that leads into many of the gaps that we've seen in the ecosystem. So by providing a strong foundation for ID proofing where it makes sense, ID proofing as part of the registration, but as well as the recovery, allows for organizations to be more flexible and lock down that recovery flow. So I'll sum up the project on what we've learned, and we'll take some questions. One of the big things that we look very closely at the project and what we've learned is the idea that when you deal with users, there's definitely a lot of PI, personal information, and you have to really take that seriously from a project standpoint. I think any company that engaged in an identity IAM project that deals with user data, particularly for your customers, I think this is a big effort to make sure that those are protected. So in this case, even though the services using the IDP are not necessarily getting access to all the PII information, there's some attribute sharing that needs to be done in a privacy preserving way as well. And obviously there are data sitting with the IPv core as well as the IDP itself. The second element that we quickly realized is that there are some technology limitations on existing third-party ID proofing mobile apps. Particularly, there are a variety of technologies out there, and it's hard to reach the highest level. But does not mean that we should just say just because we cannot reach the highest level, we're not going to get to somewhere in between, which is level 2 or the mid-level identity assurance. Because right now most of the services like no identity assurance, which is challenging for remote proofing if you want to onboard users quickly. Obviously, there's trust issues with whoever third parties you work with, and this is an ongoing effort by the industry to work more closely with all the various components to make sure that identity lifecycle from ID proofing to strong authentication to federation all work closely together. And one of the things that we faced as well with FIDO U2F is, there are still gaps within OS and devices from supportability. Today, it supports out of the box with Chrome and Opera, and there's several other browsers that are in process, but there's still some gaps. And the last area that I think I would mention on the project was that, well, it is important to think of the general population use cases and how we onboard individuals that are capable. There also needs to be several things that needs to be considered when we deal with the larger population in general, where they may have special needs, that the flow of the identity proofing as well as the authentication has to be accounted for. particularly as we were focusing on education. I would say that applies for as well with other organizations as well that have individuals that don't necessarily what we deem as a typical user. So that is the end of our presentation. We're happy to take on questions.
Thank you, Jerrod, and thanks again to all of you for tuning in. We do have several questions, so Jerrod, I'm going to kind of throw them at you one at a time, and again, we'll try to address all of them that come in the queue. So the first question pertains to the FIDO specifications. So Jerrod, obviously in this case study and the work you did, it was using the FIDO U2F protocols, which Yubico supports through your products. But there are other FIDO specifications, primarily the FIDO UAF, so the Universal Authentication Framework specification, and of course the emerging FIDO 2 set of specifications. Can you kind of touch on, how those specs would fit into this workflow? Any difference in approach? Any other considerations that attendees should be aware of?
Yes. So one of the things that we looked at is like how do all the FIDO specifications play and work in various ecosystems. So one of the things I would take even FIDO U2F out of the equation, which is how do we pre-provision credentials separately, right? So the topic comes out very often, which is like how do you pre-register someone? We took the value of FIDO U2F because of its external authenticator. You could pre-register a device out of band and then issue and send that user the hardware device. And the hardware device, you can think of it as not just necessarily just a YubiKey, but whatever hardware device that you trust. Like for example, you have a credit card, right? A credit card that you are issuing, and the bank is going to send you a credit card, a physical credit card. They're going to send you the activation code in a separate mail. So that concept is what we wanted to start with. Now, in the model where you said, okay, maybe I didn't want to do the actual hardware. You want to do maybe potentially software in this mix. It absolutely can be done, but I think that you have to think of some of the practical security considerations as well. Because what happens in the case where you're sending a software to load on maybe a hardware device that you may or may not trust, those type of issues can come up. UAF does focus a large bit on built-in authenticators on the platform, but in several cases, users may not have the right hardware to load the UAF authenticator. And so what do you do in those scenarios? So there were some practical considerations that didn't allow us to expand beyond external authenticators. Of course, that can change depending on how the ecosystem builds upon those considerations. But also as well as from a recovery flow. I mean, so sometimes I think we get very so specific with is it UF or U2F, but we wanted to call out, which is like, what's the use case? We look at having the external authenticator be a bootstrap to maybe a built-in authenticator would be the right model. So you can think of the case where after I've ID proofed the user, I've issued an external authenticator, and then I received the external authenticator, and actually the service can now say, hey, I see that you have also a phone that could be authenticated as well, but I need to know that I issued you the first hardware authenticator to bootstrap the second one. So in that model, as we get into particularly as we evolve into the FIDO 2 model, that is absolutely the use case that we want to solve, which is you can provide users with hardware devices that bootstrap built-in devices. And that really is the model of how we want to evolve these use cases. Ultimately, we can't assume that every user has a particular device or phone or laptop that has the ability to have built-in, but we do want to have the flexibility if they do. And so we felt that starting with an external authenticator, there were no dependency on whether the actual device supported the FIDO authenticators or not. So that was one of the main considerations.
Okay, thank you. Another question came in. Since the app middleware were built, with funding from a NIST grant, is this software available, or will it be available as open source? Kind of, what are the plans on? Are there plans to make this code available? And how, if and how will this be shared with the kind of broader community at large?
Well, we're working with NIST on this. We have several guidelines on how we can publish information. I would say that we also have been working with the FIDO Alliance on publishing these what we call identity toolkits, both directly through NIST, but also working with the FIDO Alliance to make sure that that toolkit is more broadly available. We have specific milestones that we meet, and then we release. From there, then this allows us to talk about where we are and then release additional tools. I would say the project is still ongoing, so we have not completed everything. We're getting close to our I think 1-year anniversary, but this is a 2-year journey for us. As we get into additional milestones, our intent is to continue to bring what we've learned to the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. Here's one. Will there be any difference between U2F tokens already issued and future IPv U2F tokens, or is the difference only on the back end?
So today, there's no change in ID verified authenticator from the future if you're following the FIDO U2F protocol. So the FIDO U2F protocol is what we use to integrate the whole ID proofing engine. As you've seen from the flow, it is a FIDO U2F flow from a registration as well as authentication. So any existing FIDO U2F authenticator can be used for this particular framework or identity toolkit. Whether that will evolve, I think we're already at even from a FIDO U2F perspective, we're at 1.2, version 1.2. So yeah, there may be some changes in the back end and some device changes from all the vendors to meet to 1.2. But the framework was to build it so that as this ecosystem evolved for both Authenticator as well as the backend, they would just evolve with the specs. And I would say that this also plays well into FIDO 2, which a number of you know that working on. FIDO 2 allows for the web authentication to occur and utilize FIDO U2F devices. So this will continue to evolve even as we get to FIDO 2, particularly with the web of N APIs, so that those set of browsers will continue to work with existing FIDO U2F devices.
Okay. Shifting topics a little bit, we're getting some kind of privacy-related questions. How does this approach to authentication, ID proofing, impact the privacy aspects of FIDO authentication? Is this a trade-off that one needs to make as an organization? Can you talked on it a little bit during the presentation, but can you expand on kind of the privacy aspects of this case study and for FIDO and ID proofing in general?
Yes, it's a huge topic in industry. I think there's been many different perspectives on such a topic. So at the foundation, FIDO is meant to be privacy preserving day one, and that still holds true today. Absolutely holds true today. FIDO, all technology that all the protocols that we are releasing are all in line with this mission of privacy preserving. Now, obviously, in the greater context of identity, the discussions on federation is definitely ongoing, and obviously, when you federate things, then the federated database will have more than just than more than they would be if works directly with the, I would say, the relying party. There are obviously some trade-offs if you do independent of this project. There are definitely some trade-offs as you move to a federated model where you trust the IDP to protect you more, and obviously you can authenticate through the IDP or directly with the service. Now, I would say that the critical element to think about privacy is that privacy in the context of whether you're internally you're deploying this internally as an organization for your users or whether to your customers has a different connotation, right? So if you are part of a company organization internally, um, the company needs to know you. You need to know you. It needs to you. They're going to be much more in terms of how you view what privacies are. Obviously, from a customer's perspective, it's different. If for your customers, you want to make sure that you don't give out too much to other people that you work with. The way we look at how we do the trade-offs are fairly simple. We're going to focus on the user groups. Which are the user groups that needs to have privacy preserving? Which of them there are some, general compromises and what that means. Particularly in this case, we were going for, if you think of all the schools in a specific school district, it would make sense for the school district to know who all the schools are and who all the staff are. But it may not make sense for every school. They need to know with all the other teachers from the other school. They may or may not, depends on the model. So in this case, the trade-off was that the centralized school district should have some control with all the teachers from each school, but each staff or principal within that school may not need to know all the other teachers from the other school. So there were some of these considerations that we talked about, and how we design it. I think it's going to be very varied in terms of how the implementers are going to approach this for their own use cases. I would say ultimately there are going to be some trade-offs, but most importantly, what are the considerations will be most focused on the user groups that should be considered based on what level of privacy that they want to provide.
Okay. Thank you. Here's a question. Do you see this process as synergistic with CAC PIV programs in the federal government, or rather as an alternative to their current credentialing efforts? How would this work in the context of the current federal PIV and Common Access Card programs?
That's a great question. I think we in FIDO Alliance, and I can speak from the FIDO Alliance perspective, we're already exploring a lot of these synergies outside of this project, which is how do you use a smart card to enable a FIDO credential? How do we do that in a way that maintains the high level of assurances? And this is absolutely on the table. I think that we built this particular framework focusing on ID proofing the user, but you could think of a similar model, which is like you've already ID proofed the user because you've issued a CAC card or a PIV card, and now you want to provide the strong authentication. So I would say that this is as a parallel discussion. I wouldn't necessarily say that this particular project that we're working on fits exactly in that model, but you could think of a model where, speaking outside of this project, that you could issue FIDO authenticators with a existing authenticator in terms of like a CAC card or PIV card, so that you tie it all together. So because again, I brought up a point on the specifications where you can actually separate out the key handle and the public key, which is the most critical piece. I think if all the implementers out there listening, that is really the foundational FIDO piece that allows you to combine this with other ecosystems. The fact that you don't have to go create a PKI just to issue out a user cert and then make sure that the CAs are all synced up and trusted, that is the critical piece for the scale, because you can actually take it out. You can take the public key for the user and the key handle and tie it to whatever model you want, right? So in the case of the PIV and CAC card program, if you're authenticating the user with a PIV CAC card, you already have a data store, you already know the user, you ID proofed it, probably in proofing as well. And what you want to do is as well, the PIF card and the CAD card doesn't work with these other services because they just don't work with smart cards. But if you at the same time say, after I authenticated the PIF and the CAD card, issue you a FIDO credential, and then you tie it in your whatever backend that you have with the key handle and the public key. Now you have a model that the user has two types of credential. You've derived. I don't want to talk too much about this because I've been working on separate projects on this, but you can start to move to a model whereby you are deriving FIDO credentials from existing very strong um, credential using smart cards. So I would say that it's not directly tied to this project, but the FIDO Alliance and a number of us in the organization have been thinking through this, and it totally makes sense because of the way the FIDO protocols are built.
Okay, great. We're going to spend a couple more minutes with questions. We have a lot. We're doing our best to get to all of them. On ID proofing, this is a question from the audience. I would think that financial institutions or state DMV offices are an ideal place for strong ID proofing, as most people have a relationship with both of those, one or both of those organizations. What are your thoughts on those types of bodies being used for strong ID proofing? Was that factored into the case study you did? And how's that relate to the overall kind of ID proofing lifecycle?
Great question. I think I missed covering it. So the third-party ID proofing technologies that we've used, they all actually, our goal is that they are validating that against some entity. In the case of the driver's license, after the user scanned their driver's license, the third-party proofing engine would go verify that at DMV. And actually, the reason why you get back the name and the address is from the DMV database. That they actually have a physical record of you who registered at the DMV. You're registered, your address, your name, your whatever your car license plate, everything's there. So that response that we get back to store it in the IPv core is from actually through the third-party app, but is from DMV. Now you could do the same type of process if you wanted with other entities, whether it's the U.S. Postal Service or whatever the model is. Again, we put it as a box where you can decide what you want. We just chose a certain path, which was using DMV because DMV already has the user's address. You're improving yourself at DMV to get your license, and you've done all the work itself. So we're leveraging the existing framework. So absolutely right. I didn't call it out, but we are using DMV for our ID proofing. Ultimately, our ID proof user to stem from that perspective, but it doesn't have to be DMV. It could be any other entity that the organization tries. It could be a bank as well. I mean, absolutely. It could be if you do ID proofing with your bank, you got to show, today you show, again, a lot of it goes back to some type of state or federal owned identity, and then you work it from that perspective. So the ecosystem allows, or the framework and the identity toolkit allows you to select what is most appropriate for your use case. Again, it could be state, local, federal, bank institution, your healthcare provider. As long as you trust their process for ID proofing, we wanted to make it very flexible for implementers to carve out however they see fit.
Okay. Do you see a way for remote strong cryptographic binding between a FIDO Authenticator, which is already owned by the user, and the ID proofing step in our organization?
It goes a lot back to the NIST latest guidance or digital identity guidance. I encourage audience who haven't read that to review that. Some major changes from revision 2 to revision 3. I think that just general challenges, both practically as well as technology, that prevents they're quite tight in terms of how you get to highest level of identity proofing assurance. I think certainly we will see more innovation in this area of remote proofing, like making sure that you cannot trick your phone to take a fake ID or something like that. I think that's going to get better over time. Um, Inherently, it's both policy and technology has to work together to make that happen. I believe that we are moving fast right now in terms of allowing a lot of innovations going on to make sure that the ID proofing is better. But I think what's missing, and that's why we focus on this project, is to tie in all these new technologies from ID proofing into the actual and entire identity workflow. Most companies are thinking about it, or most implementers think about it separately. I think we're calling out to the industry to say, you got to really think about this end to end. If you provide strong ID proofing, remote ID proofing, you solve a lot of the other open items in the ecosystem, particularly with recovery, as I mentioned a couple of times. If you can ID proof the user often and frequently because you've lost the authenticator, then the need for some type of SMS code to recover the user is gone. And so we should not be thinking about all these things separately. We should think about them collectively. And there are many types of organizations as well as institutions that require a pretty high level of identity assurance. And so let's not build systems that all don't talk together. I mean, that's what we've been set out to do from the NIST project. Let's try to build systems that can leverage the advantages from the technology for what the ecosystem is providing. So remote proofing is absolutely on the table to get better, and we need to tie that into the identity lifecycle.
Super. So let me ask you one last question, because you've been generous with your time and we're at the top of the hour. Before I ask that, I just want to note that there are other questions in the queue that we have not gotten to. There are some Yubico specific questions, which I'll pass on to the Yubico team for follow-up, who will answer your questions. And then any other questions, we'll do our best to come back to you, or you can always send an email to info@fidoalliance.org, and we will answer your questions there. So last question here. Can this ID proofing workflow be adapted to the enterprise? If so, do you need other pieces? How would you contrast taking this work to the enterprise versus the work that was already done?
Yeah, that's a great question. We work with a number of different solution vendors out in the market today. I think a lot of it is still piecing the pieces together. Ultimately, our goal is to help the implementers and the customers and organizations that need it. And I think if the model is that, why are all the pieces separately today? I think it's a hard question. Why is it like that? But what we want to get to is that if the enterprise is selected an IAM vendor already today, I don't see why there cannot be connectors and additional extensions to make it work. Because really the framework is all there. And particularly if the IAM vendors are building FIDO U2F support, and we know, and we're working with a number of them as well, and they are actually, the number of IAM vendors today are either in process to finish up their FIDO implementations or close. There are a number of them in close betas. So we don't see a reason why they cannot extend it out to have additional extensions to say, hey, we want this ID proofing extension as well with your platform. There's no reason it shouldn't be. I mean, this is a connected discussion. Federation, with most IAM vendors started with Federation, and now everyone is really thinking about how to put strong authentication with Federation, and I think it's happening right now. If you wanted the list of the ones that are working on FIDO U2F, you can reach out to us separately. But then I would argue that don't stop there. After you've done Federation and you've done strong authentication, hey, let's just do ID proofing as well, and particularly for customers, organizations that are thinking about this a bit differently in terms of, like, it's not just for employees, but I want to solve this for my customers. Why not? Why not integrate some of these capabilities into the IAM stack for ID proofing? And I would also argue that more and more of the sharing economy has remote employees. So having remote ID proofing as part of the identity workflow should be considered day one, right? So I know that the various industries, both retail, banking, healthcare, insurance, they have a lot of remote users. So today, I think the ID proofing is subpar, which is come to your closest office that you may have to drive, I don't know, 50 miles, 100 miles, whatever, to be ID proof before you start is a non-starter if you want to move quicker. So I think the conversation that we started when we started this project was to say, there's nothing to wait right now. This is a connected discussion. ID proofing with strong authentication for those regulated industries is the way forward. How do we bring everything together in a way that everyone can benefit? And that's what this project's all about.
Okay, thank you, Jerrod. Thank you all for attending today, and thanks to Jerrod again for taking time to present this case study and also to hang around for so many questions. So please do take a moment to complete the survey when you log off. And if you have any further questions, again, you can email us at info@fidoalliance.org. We'll look forward to seeing you on a future FIDO Alliance webinar. With that, let's wrap up. Thank you.